Madam Speaker, we believe that life is precious, and that it is this notion that our time on this earth is limited that drives human endeavors and pushes us to extremes, to strive for more, and to improve humanity. And to that end, we believe that the discovery of a means to stop the aging process would be a curse to humanity. So what do we mean by this? We don't think the model needs to be quite too specific. We think that we're having a comparative debate about the worlds in which this technology exists and when it doesn't. This technology, we think, is a medical procedure that is reasonably inexpensive but not ubiquitous, and that you would have to seek out. It wouldn't automatically happen to you. And that if you underwent it, you would live forever at the age of 35 years as your body existed at that time, and would not die unless you were the victim of disease or some accident or murder or something like that. So, given that this is the case, I want to advance two arguments about why we think this would be detrimental to humanity. I want to talk first about the pragmatic harms that humanity would suffer from in a world where most people, or certainly those in the countries where this is prolific, didn't die. And secondly, I want to talk about the philosophical harms to the human project and to the advancement of humanity. So first, let's discuss the pragmatic harm. We think from a practical perspective that this technology would doom humanity. We think firstly that this would result in massive overpopulation for two reasons. First, we think that if no one died, self-evidently, at our current rate of population growth, things with populations would get bigger. But what's more important, though, is that no one would ever become infertile. Everyone would be infinitely fertile and could have babies for their entire lives, which now are hundreds of years. So we think that every 20 years or so, you roll over and create a new class of people who are just as fertile as a generation before them, but that the generation before them could possibly still have children. This, we think, is incredibly problematic for a number of reasons. Firstly, we believe, in a world where there is such massive overpopulation, that the world is likely to run out of resources. So things like food, things like energy that we use to feed our populations and power our societies and to live in the world that we do, that make our lives comfortable and that allow us to live at a reasonable level of welfare would go out the window. We think this is incredibly problematic. We also think, though, that on their side of the house, we would see a massive degradation of the environment. We think the fact that population has exploded over the last 200 years or so is part of the reason why we've seen problems like global warming that has led to things like natural disasters and crop shortages in the developing world. We think these problems are exacerbated on their side of the house because all these problems continue, but now we have to feed hundreds of millions and possibly billions of more people. We now have to power hundreds of thousands or millions of new homes. We think this means that all these problems are exacerbated. They now occur more quickly and are more acute. So on their side of the house, yes, there are many more people, but we believe that these people, I'll take you at the end of this, would live in misery. They would not have the things that they're accustomed to. But even worse, wouldn't even have the basic necessities that we believe are necessary to live a reasonably comfortable life with the dignity that we believe people deserve. We think that the turnover of population is necessary in this respect, and on their side of the house, the world could quite literally fall apart. Yes?
When people no longer need to have children, so they can continue the family line or leave a legacy, won't there be a lot less children?
No, because we think that people want to have children for reasons other than pragmatically that they want to continue their family line. We think there's something incredibly special about a couple who has a child and decides to undergo that emotional experience together. That people are going to continue to want to engage in child rearing because they believe it's important to pass on their traditions and to engage in the emotional experience of raising a child together. We certainly think that this is not going to go away. So on their side of the house, they do have to fight the harm of overpopulation. But also we think on their side of the house, there are massive social harms that occur. Because now, social upheaval, rebellion, and revolutions become far more likely. First of all, we think that rioting and social upheaval in this way, through violent means, is far more likely on their side of the house. Why is this the case? Because we believe that populations are more likely to react violently to the class that rules them and determines their society when they have no means of advancement. We think this is right, for example, in post-colonial Africa, when 35-year-olds were very quickly promoted to positions of high prominence within the government when the colonists left, that the people who were just under them and would have normally had opportunities for promotion didn't get them. That this is why many African countries entered into a cycle of coups and rebellions, because there was nothing for these people to do and no way for them to advance. But that's exactly the case on their side of the house, except to a far greater extent. Those elites who hold power never have any reason to lead, so those below them never have any possibility to advance. We think that people always want to keep their stranglehold on power, that even those in democratically elected countries with democratic regimes are likely to feel as if they have no place to advance and no place to go, and so are likely to engage in social rebellion and upheaval, and to use violent means to change their societies because they feel nihilistically as if they have no control. We think that's a problem. We also think it's a problem, though, that in parts of the world where there are not democratic governments, that dictators never die on their side of the house. So now, places like Cuba and places like Zimbabwe never have to undergo any process of political change. We think it's very easy for these dictators to hold on to power for decades and decades, as they've done in places like, for example, Mugabe in Zimbabwe. We think that many of these places only undergo social change when these dictators die and these political figures lose power. But that never happens on their side of the house. They hold power indefinitely. So now, either people are subjected to decades or perhaps centuries of oppression, or have to turn to violent means to change things. We think that's a problem for society. Sure, Sam.
Will there still be boredom?
Will there still be boredom? Yes, and we think that when people are bored, these people are going to turn to things like violence because there's nothing else for them to do. When all the positions at universities are occupied by the same academics who've had them for decades, and positions of political power are occupied by the same people who've had them for decades, of course they're going to be bored, and they're going to have to turn to something else. The second thing I want to talk about then is why this undermines the human project. We think that people in general do good and strive to have an impact on the world in positive ways because of their legacy. That people believe that people's fear of death drives them to do good things because they know they have at most 100 years on this earth, and if they want to have an impact, they need to do it now. That's not the case on their side of the house, though. There's no reason to help other people if you can wait 100 or 200 years in relaxation and accumulate wealth and delay it until later. We think this process, though, is inevitable on their side of the house, that there's never any reason to say, my time is suddenly finite, ergo I should start doing good for other people. So that's problematic. But we also think, more importantly, that on their side of the house, they undermine human advancement. We all know the saying that science advances one funeral at a time, and we think that's particularly true. That when the same people with the same beliefs occupy positions of influence in academia and in the formulation of ideas, that these ideas never advance. That ideologies like racism slowly die out when the racists die, but that on their side of the house, these people never go away. These elites who hold views that we believe are wrong, that society progresses past, never die out, so their ideologies and the problems that come with them persist indefinitely. We think this is incredibly problematic. We think, Madam Speaker, that for you to believe what the arguments we're about to hear from their side of the House, you would have to believe that human society was at its apex. We believe it is not. We believe that humanity has much further to go, but that this sort of technology would stop progress in its tracks. For these reasons, we're incredibly proud to
I thank the Speaker for his speech, and now to the Leader of the Opposition to open the case for his team.
The tragedy of human life is that when we're young, we have all of the vitality, but none of the time. And when we are old, we have all of the time in the world, but none of the vitality to do things that we want. Absent in the discussion of opening government is about the individual and how this can dramatically improve the lives of individuals and give them the freedom to dictate the way they want to live out their lives. Before that, a few rebuttals. Firstly, on the notion of practical harms. They gave us three main harms. Firstly, overpopulation. We say that A, there's contraception, and B, what happens is that if you do not have no longer the impetus to live out a legacy, to make sure that someone you know, that one of your children can live out a wealth, then that's where you do not have the incentive, the overwhelming imperative to have children. We think that this, when you can live out your life over 35 and still have your youth, you can delay your the need to have children, or you may find give you more incentive to have long-term family planning, right? And we say that it's possible for individuals to respond to the pressures of overpopulation, to know that, well, it's maybe in this city it's not the right time to have children right now. On the second level, we say that overpopulation is only a problem if you cannot support that population. We think that as long as you're able to come up with ingenious measures to come up to house these individuals, to develop rural areas to house these individuals, this will not be a problem. Overpopulation is only an issue also if there are too many old people that you cannot support, right? That they will continue to be a burden upon your society. We don't think that's going to happen under our paradigm, because these people, although they are there, they still have their vitality, they're still able to work, they still will be productive. And we say what's going to happen is that we say the economy is going to be a lot more productive because there are going to be a lot more people who are young, who are vibrant at age of 35, who can contribute to the economy. No, thank you. Then let's go on to talk about the environment, right? Because they say that, well, we're going to hurt the environment a lot more because we will clear up land. We're going to make it such that it's going to be a lot more difficult to preserve the environment as we know it. We say that the reason why we have problems dealing with the environment right now is because people do not see the effects, people do not feel the impact, and people think that this is a problem for future generations. What we argue in this case is that when these people can live out their lives and they can see that beyond 35, they will still be in the world when the end when these resources are depleted, it makes them have more impetus to want to ensure that in terms of public policy planning, that these things are taken into consideration, right? So we say that the state as a whole, right, has incentive to ensure that given that there are limited resources, how do you manage that resource to ensure that you accommodate these people who are still going to be around? We said it makes environment much more of a priority for these governments as it is compared to right now, where it is a problem for the people of the future, where the government is trying to cater to the people of the now. On the third level, let's do the argument of elites, right? Because they say that, well, when dictators don't die, while their legacies continue. We say that when dictators do die, Kim Jong-il died, and they still managed to continue it, right? So we don't think that there's a necessary argument for the toppling of dictators. What we argue is, in fact, that the reason why these elites are able to establish their position in society is because of legacy. It's because they are able to build up this wealth and build up all this power over different generations. What we argue is that when individuals are able to live out their lives over a prolonged period of time, they are able to counter that by able to be able to build up their own personal wealth to counter the wealth of these elites. So we think it's a good thing, members of this house, that they're able to do so. And then we want to deal with the philosophical harms that they talked about, right? Because they said that the only reason why people do good is because they know they're going to die, and that's why they want to ensure that they leave a positive impact on society. We don't think that is an overwhelming imperative for people to do good. We think people do good out of a moral need to do good. They recognize that it is a good thing to do something positive for society. That in fact, what we argue is that the prospect of death makes people more self-interested. That makes them want to make sure that they get the most out of the limited time they have on this earth, and makes it more unlikely that they will take time out of their own personal life to go and help others, because that means, members of this house, that they are not working for themselves. Let me go on to tell you about my substantive, because this is going to clash directly a lot with the arguments coming from the other side. I'm going to tell you why this is better for the individual. Because what happens, members of this house, is that individuals are bound to the cycle of life. Sorry, go on.
So you say that we can find technologies to solve the problems of overpopulation, but there's only so much land in the world that we can grow crops on or make food from. When the population gets so large that we run out, what happens on your side of the house?
What we argue at the end of the day is that people are still going to die due to illness, and this population can be controlled in some way. There are massive swaths of land in Central America, in the United States, in China, that they are not developed. That in fact, there are many ingenious green technology that are done to develop technologies. In fact, we can now grow vegetables, we can have farms on top of high-rise buildings. So we think these are ingenious ideas that can come out of this particular situation. We think that's a good thing. Let me go back to my argument, right? Because what we say is that more often than not, individuals are confined to this birth, youth, aging, death cycle, right? This often restricts the ability for us to do what we really want to fulfill our own identity. Some of us want to take a gap year. Some of us want to go and study at college for the sake of, we want to take master degree after master degree, doctorate after doctorate, right? But we can't do that, because what happens is that we are restrained by this limited time that we have in the world. What we also argue that in fact people cannot delay marriage because they need to get married young, because the moment they hit a certain age, they may not be able to give birth. We say, members of this house, by allowing people to delay the aging process, to not age, members of this house, what happens is that you free these individuals of the confines of time. You let these individuals have the ability to decide what they want to do at whatever point that they want in their lives. And what this does, members of this house, maximize the liberties that this individual has. Because right now, I can choose when I want to start work, I can choose when I want to start my family. I'm not limited to the idea that in 30 years' time I'm going to die, or limited by the idea that I need to work now in order to make sure that I have money for my retirement. On the second level, what we argue is that aging also robs people of their agency and of their vitality, and this creates certain harms, right? Because what we say is that there are many diseases that are associated with age that robs you of your agency. Alzheimer's, right? Your memory, your eyesight, all these things deteriorate age. All these things, members of this house, makes it a lot harder for you to interact with the world as you know it, to interact with the families that you know, the communities that you build over time. And what we argue, members of this house, is that these experiences make up your life. And when you do not have the ability to interact it in a very fruitful manner, what we argue, members of this house, is that your life is not as fruitful as it can be. On the second level, what we say is that the loss of vitality means that when you have all the time in the world when you're older, what you're not able to do is that you're not able to have the ability and the vitality to accomplish accomplish, to travel, to hike, to work, to explore different areas of different industries or different interests they may have, right? Because there are certain things that just require physical vitality to do, which does not exist under the current paradigm. Clearly, members of this house, we need to think about how this affects the individual. This frees the individuals from the boundaries of time. We think it's a good thing. This motion must fall.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and now to the second speaker from Open Government to conclude the case for his team.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In a world in which populations are relatively small and resources are plentiful, gap years are fun. In a world in which the population is growing out of control constantly and resources are becoming more and more limited, and every individual who is born has less and less opportunity to do something in their life because other people in the world have already occupied all the necessary roles, all the leisure that they talk about turns into a life of misery. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to deal with first rebuttal and some of the arguments we dealt with. Then I want to explain why this ultimate machine actually creates enormous inequity between like the global north and global south. And then I want to walk through more specifically the life of an individual who was born hundreds of years down the line once this machine comes into existence. So first, let's deal with the question of overpopulation. We get this assertion that says like, oh, there's contraception, so the population is going to grow. This is absurd. One, plenty of places don't have access to contraception or contraception fails. That is to say, people make mistakes and people have sex for fun for all sorts of reasons. And the result is that populations grow, that children are born. Now those are drastically overwhelmed by the number of other cases of births, right? But not in a world in which anytime any of those people have babies, in that case, it just continues to aggregate more and more and more. This is particularly true, by the way, as well, because there are some people who have religious objections to contraception, which means there are certain populations that are never willing to not use contraception in one way or another. And, as Josh explained, there's also a desire when two people love each other to feel as if they're going to undergo a project together and have a child which is about their love for each other and the world that they want to build for a child. That is not eliminated. The problem is, yes, it may be on a societal level beneficial to have fewer children in this case, but that doesn't mean that individual people won't believe like, hey, I want to have a child and I'm going to do this. We know this is empirically true, for example, because plenty of people in poor countries have children all the time, and we think like, hey, this probably would not be a good idea for your total net income in the future, or you can't provide for them, and yet they do it anyway. People aren't rational in that context. They're short-sighted. This basic time inconsistency that exists in people's decisions means that overpopulation is enormous. Now they say, well, it doesn't matter if there's lots of overpopulation because, we'll just develop new resources and deal with it. Okay, that's fine. You want to cross your fingers that you happen to develop all the magical technology necessary that you can keep up with the massive overpopulation. We say it's not worth that risk. It's particularly not worth that risk in light of the argument that Josh made, that is to say that science is likely to advance much slower in this world because the people who have this sort of old ideologies no longer have can maintain control of the world for decade after decade, for century after century. Yeah.
Given that the wisdom of these people who have died because of old age are retained because they have their vitality, they have the presence of mind to communicate it to generations in the future, why do you still think that technology will not advance the rate?
The point is, we don't believe that the wisdom of old age is actually what's necessary in these cases. We believe that the wisdom of old age is actually massive prejudice and a belief in an old system both culturally and scientifically. We believe that the world moves forward because those people die out and because new people come into the world and because new people take over control. In fact, there is forward progress in humanity exactly for that reason, regardless of the sort of belief that says like, old people have been around a lot, so they've gotten to be racist for a long time. So, that simply doesn't apply in this case. Then, so we say it's enormously devastating because there are simply not enough resources. You have massive overpopulation. We also say it devastates the environment because there's no interest in the individual technology at that time. That is, people say, oh, I'll deal with it later, or they don't fully internalize the risk that occurs, and you get massive increases in global warming and things of that sort, right? That has an effect not only on the people themselves who can access this technology, but on the massive amounts of individuals who are poor, sort of straight across the world, people who don't have access to the kinds of solutions to these problems in and of itself, right? So let's move on to the other ways that this policy is devastating in terms of global dynamics. The first is that it creates a horrible dynamic between first world countries and third world countries. That's to say that we explain that this technology is one which is relatively cheap, right, and you have an access to, but it's a medical procedure, which means almost certainly the people who have access to it are the wealthy countries, the people who can seek out like medical procedures in one place or another. That is not true when it comes to, for example, individuals living in massive rural areas, third world areas, things of that sort. The implication is that the population explosion that you get is among lots and lots of wealthy countries in an enormous number of cases, or those individuals who have access to this technology in one way, right? So it creates enormous population discrepancy between those two groups, allowing those individuals from wealthy countries to devastate third world countries. First, Conrad.
So I'm curious, why wouldn't you be okay with different kinds of population controls for those people who decide to use this technology, or just society generally? In the abstract, I suppose one doesn't have an issue with that. The issue is that we say those policies are not meaningfully going to be implemented, that the reality is the short-sightedness of human nature means that we're going to be very far behind any kind of meaningful policy, or if you're going to do it, then you'll get the exact kind of policies we just heard a lecture on, where you, for example, have forced abortions for individuals because it's the only way to meaningfully reduce population. So unless you have a magical idea to reduce population that the nation of China has not come up with, we would like to hear in this round, and also hear why it would be implemented across the entire world, because that's what's necessary for you to win the debate in that context. So, we say massive population growth by very rich countries. What do those people do? They, one, have devastating environmental effects on poor countries, and two, they begin to migrate and take over those poor countries. That's to say there's a need for land, and the poor people pay the elites, for example. You pay elites in Malawi, and you say, we're going to live here, and then you have like stupid Americans who are taking over these massive places in Africa, in which those countries and those cultures don't have individuals who are able to live perpetually, but instead you have massively wealthy people from the first world who are taking over in all of those situations. So those populations grow more and more and more, and they take out any ability for the people in those countries to live a meaningful life, because at the very outset they have wealth inequality, and because they have the ability to accumulate wealth over their lifetime in a way that those other people don't. But second, what is the effect of an individual that is born many, many decades down the line? The reality is, for those individuals, there are almost no opportunities. To say that you have individuals who are currently alive, who are themselves have no desire in altruism, because they think, oh, I have the potential to live for hundreds of years down the future, I should just accumulate as much wealth now, and in a couple hundred years I'll deal with those other cases, because as much as we'd like to have a rosy picture of humanity, most people don't go out of their way to do lots of things for other people instantaneously if they feel like, hey, I have the opportunity down the line, which means you have young people who don't have access to the same kind of jobs, who don't have access to the same kind of institutions, who sit around without any of those resources or any of those availabilities, who suffer from the fact that there are far too resources for these people across the board, who end up engaging in more violence as they feel frustration, as they feel like they're going to revolt. We have these situations, for example, all the time in countries across the world in which we have too much of an entrenched, very old, very wealthy population. If we allow that to happen straight across the board, because those are the people who have access to live forever, then you create far more anger and unrest from an individual. So even if it would be nice to have some kind of meaningful life where you could live forever, not in a world in which the wealthy people take over the entire population, live forever, and dominate the world.
I thank the speaker very much for his speech, and now look to the second speaker from the opening position to conclude the first half of this debate.
Even if we buy the harms they present to us, we think it is a blessing that individuals now don't have to live a life with Alzheimer's, that they don't have to watch as the world that they lived in crumbles around them, as they forget who their children are, as their families see their loved parent forget who they are, as vibrant, healthy individuals lose any capacity to define a life for themselves because of old age. Where people who define themselves on the basis of being active, being able to seize the day, being able to do things, being able to meet people, to interact. Where the agency is lost because I'm sitting in a wheelchair at my own pace, I rely on people to change me. We think even if we buy the harms they present to us, it is a blessing that people under our model can do this. There's no response to this argument from that side, and we think that's problematic because what that side does is it prioritizes this abstract notion of society as a whole above the lives of individual people who we think have far better lives under our model. The other thing they didn't deal with was also this idea about the ability of individuals to define themselves because no one by life cycles, and it's important as well. There's no response to this argument. But let's deal with what actually they do say before going on to the arguments, two arguments I have about why this improves state policy in which countries, particularly those facing budget pressures, and why also this improves the lives of women. Right? But what they present to us several arguments. First, they talk to us about overpopulation, right? And they say that they present this Malthusian apocalypse where basically nobody has any food to eat and everyone's fighting with each other, and somehow the masses in North America will swarm over to Mexico or Mali because they want the land there. Several responses to this. First, America is massive, right? These countries are amazingly huge. And we don't think this is really an issue that people want to go to these poor nations. Don't do these arguments, that's all. But more importantly, the reality is that the progress in human history has shown us that we've always been able to respond to population increases, right? Malthus proposed that population would not be able to increase in the middle 19th century. We dealt with it because we had things like the Green Revolution, we had fertilizers. And we think the progress will continue. And so we don't really see that this is an issue. More importantly, he missed the analysis that my speaker presented to you. That what happens when people can live forever is that then the long-term cost of any policy they put in place are also visited upon them. Given that people are more likely to act in their self-interest, we think it's far more likely, therefore, that they support sustainable policies. They support policies that encourage resource conservation. But the problem now is that any policies that destroy the earth, any environmentally damaging policies, are policies that affected and harm future generations. So people acting out of self-interest don't care about these particular things, right? Then he presents to us this idea that basically young people will have no opportunity to access because somehow there are only a fixed amount of jobs in the economy, and there's only so much money in the economy that anybody can earn, and then somehow all the academic positions are only the same. We don't think that's true, right? We think as more people grow, we think that as these people continue to be productive, we think that these people continue to work in these jobs, more jobs open up for more people as the economy grows, right? More positions are created. Young people have access to these particular things. In terms of political power, I really don't understand why some people remain in power forever just because they happen to have lived slightly longer years, right? If as they claim, population increases and more young people rise up, they also gain a form of political power. They have the ability to choose the people that they want. We don't see they haven't presented any analysis of why some people will stay there forever. The only real thing they told us that rich people can create lots of wealth and live forever on that particular basis. But look, rich people always have the ability to accumulate wealth, whether it's to pass it down to their children or themselves. But what we think happens under our model is that individuals, people in poor societies, have a longer time and capacity to be able to earn that wealth. Right? And that's something that I've presented to you, my first speaker. No response from that side. Right? Because now they can work longer, they have longer lives, they don't need to suffer old age, they can better accumulate wealth to challenge any hierarchies that exist in society. And furthermore, he claims that people are not self-interested. Again, he didn't deal with the analysis that my speaker presented to you, that people are more likely to be less self-interested when they don't have to deal with a finite amount of time. When they know that they have longer periods of time to live, then they have more time, the more ability to help other people. That's something they didn't deal with now.
People are terrible at discounting the future and figuring out. That's why they make all decisions all the time that are considered incredibly time inconsistent. Why is it true that expanding that over to hundreds and hundreds of years makes you think they'll be better at making those calculations?
No, we just don't think that's true. Sure, I don't always have the people are not always the most foresighted of individuals, but at least people know that they don't want to be living a horrible life hundreds of years down the road, or 100 years down the road, or even 50 years down the road, right? That's something that they don't want, that people rationally don't want to achieve. And we think that in an instance where people will live forever, they're better able to accumulate some form of common sense and knowledge that we think will pass on to these individuals, right? But let me move on to like two main areas of contribution, new material that I have today. First, about state policy and like rich world problems, right? First, we see that in many rich developing countries today, the primary problem that's being faced upon this is budgetary pressures. As a growing, aging population is supported by a lower and shrinking tax base. This means that's why there are huge deficits in areas like America and Europe, for example, which aging populations place burdens on things like social security and welfare programs. And the response to this has been an attempt to cut back on these programs, which ultimately harm poor people the most, which ultimately harm many poor old people the most in this particular context, right? We think that when you remove the pressures to old age, remove these budgetary pressures, you do two things. One, not only do you ensure that there's capacity to support the poorer and weaker members of society, you also ensure that a larger tax base, a larger workforce is able to contribute to these particular things and build a better, stronger state that's able to invest in things like infrastructure, doesn't have to choose between these particular issues, right? We think also we think also this opens up greater possibility for wealth transfers to occur, right? For more redistributionist tax policies and more progressive tax policies, because in this particular context, basically, because people create wealth for longer periods of time, they're less jealous of the wealth and are more willing to give it up in form of taxation. And we think ultimately it's something that's good, right? Second, we think this also massively benefits women for two reasons. One, there's less pressure upon them to have children, less pressure upon them by government agencies, by children groups to have children before a particular age, before they basically lose the childbearing years. We think it's incredibly important because a great deal of sexism today in cultures is rooted on the idea there's a limited amount of time. They may tell us that, look, the solution is to correct sexism. But we don't live in a perfect world where we can snap our fingers and say, sexism be gone, right? We must live with the world that we have. And we think that in a world in which women no longer face that pressure, sexism is more likely to be reduced in this regard, right? Second argument we say is that this also means that women often no longer have to choose between establishing their careers and getting a family and being pregnant. Because a huge barrier between women advancing their careers is the fact that they want to start a family. This means that they postpone their careers, and this harms their career advancement. This doesn't exist under a model, and it helps them massively as well. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, because we believe that people have the ability and should have the right to be able to live the life, a full and healthy life, and because we believe this helps society, helps women, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker very much for his speech, and now look to the first speaker from Closing Government to open the case for the second round.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. What Will and I will tell you today is that almost all of our communities and social institutions are premised at some level on the notion that we need people to take care of us. That one day we will become frail, we will be threatened, and people ought to have some sort of mechanism in place to control for that. What we lose on their side of the house is that feeling, because each of us is now burdened with the knowledge that we are essentially invincible, particularly in the developed world, where people don't really die of anything except the deeply degenerative diseases anymore, right? Like, so some people still die of accidents, sure, right? But mostly, people live for a very long time, and we say that has deeply deleterious effects on our social order that cause not only practical harms, but deep psychological harms that make life hardly worth living anymore. But before I deal with that, I want to deal with a couple of pieces of rebuttal. So the first thing that we were told is that, like, look guys, it's just better because nobody gets Alzheimer's anymore. We will concede that Alzheimer's and other degenerative diseases are not an ideal state of the world, and we understand that, right? But the reality is that many people in their world are are trapped in crushing poverty because they live in places that aren't particularly convenient to live in, right? Recognize that one of the particular ways that the developing world is disadvantaged by this policy is that is the place where disease is most prevalent and most likely to kill you because you don't have access to medicines that we have in the developed world, right? That means that the gap continues to increase between the first and third world, and it only gets worse on their side of the house, right? So for every sad story that they can tell us about our present world, their world creates another one. But furthermore, we really just do believe that our harms outweigh, right? All of the practical stuff that was given to you by our opening half is devastating, and all of the social harms are even worse that Will and I are going to present to you. The second thing we were told is that this helps because state policies now don't focus on like budgetary pressures and things like that. But what we tell you fundamentally is that they've misunderstood the way in which people interact with the knowledge of their new invincibility, right? What we tell you, and what I'll explain further in our extension, is that this doesn't make people more likely to sacrifice. It increases an individual's atomization from society because now they no longer need people, right? All you need to succeed is the ability to feed yourself, presumably people still need food, is the ability to subsist, and then you basically aren't frail and don't have any threats, right? And what's more is that people will perceive it that way, Madam Speaker, and they are thus more likely to jealously hoard what they have and continue trying to accumulate things because there's no reason for them to build up a community or a support network. Okay, on to our extension.
Before it.
Sure.
Right. Isn't it better for us to build communities based on mutual respect and trust rather than on the idea that I want you to support me when I'm old?
Okay, I think that sounds like a lovely idea, but does not mesh very well at all with the actual notions of how we create communities and what incentivizes people to make those communities, right? So the first thing we're going to tell you is that people build support groups, which actually clashes very well with this POI, for reasons that are not necessarily the same as the benefits that they ultimately derive from those support groups, right? So what we would tell you is that people derive a lot of benefits from support groups, no thank you, but they don't necessarily make those with those in mind, right? So it's not necessarily the case that people go into communities because they want to derive the sense of oneness or the various social externalities that arise, right? What we would tell you is that people go into those communities for one of two reasons, right? So we would differentiate between two types of social institutions that might be created. So the first are things like religious institutions or various support groups that we say primarily crop up because of the existential angst that comes from needing to answer the question, who am I, why am I here, and what should I do with this limited set of time, right? We say that their side massively disincentivizes people from not only from struggling with those questions deeply because they seem to have an infinite amount of time to deal with it, but furthermore, it disincentivizes people from being worried about those issues, right? Of what should I do with my limited time, and thus are less likely to form those communities. But there's also a second type of community that gets formed, right? And those are things like social bonds, like a marriage, or like community associations that are designed to make sure that each of us is taken care of, right? One of the main reasons that we develop things like social insurance programs that ensure that everyone is included in our community and is provided for is because we all know that our commonality is that we will grow old and die and along the way not be able to take care of ourselves and something should develop, right? What we tell you is that there is no more material incentive for those sorts of things to develop on their side of the house. No, thank you. So we say that both of those things fall away under their system. Even if they don't fall away entirely, they occur in a much less way than they do now, right? There's much less incentive for those things to happen. Will and I say that this is a problem for a few reasons. I'll take back half before I move on.
So, if people use this technology, and presumably one of the most common ways that people die is some form of suicide, isn't that a reason that people are more likely to be much more introspective about what death means and what it means to be human, and consequently have a better psychological understanding of all of the things you're talking about?
I don't think it is, Madam Speaker, and I think the reason is because people are going to not have to grapple immediately with those sorts of questions in the ways that push them to form community networks, right? So I think it's possible that somewhere down the line, people will feel that their life is meaningless and that they've exhausted what they can do and want to kill themselves. But that doesn't mean that they've engaged in the community and created all of the externalities that I'm going to tell you about now, right? So the first reason that we would tell you these social groups are beneficial is because of the existential angst that they help us deal with, right? The issues of what you should do and how you should live matter, right? Those are the things that worry people the most, or that worry most people most of the time, and that we believe people should be working to solve and working to understand. Those are the types of things that people need support groups to help them figure out, right? Those are incredibly difficult questions to grapple with. There's obviously no clear answer to those questions. And we say the more that people come together to figure those things out, the more likely they are to be happy. What's perverse on their side of the house is that people are tricked into believing those are questions that they ought not grapple with because life seems infinite. But those are questions that everyone still should be grappling with, even if they can't die of natural causes. So what we would say is that they lose out on all of those things because the incentives are no longer in place for them to consider them, even though people still should be thinking about those sorts of things. But furthermore, we would tell you that there are severe pragmatic harms, right? Because the benefits that come from building community aren't just on the psychological level, but on the real level of the provision of communal goods, like the fact that neighbors watch out for each other, and all of those sorts of things. The communal bonds of trust that keep communities together and make life easier in all sorts of little ways that's hard to quantify, but that all of us recognize from the way that we exist in society every day. What we tell you is that their side has massively less incentive for people to engage in those things, because you don't need to come together with people to support you, right? You lose the material incentive for people to come together to build support networks. What we tell you on theirs is that their side of the house has the false allure of invincibility that makes people disengage from communities and destroys all of the social institutions that we build up to deal with the reality of death. And that has those institutions have positive externalities, which we are very proud to stand with.
I thank the speaker for his speech and look to the member for opposition, to open the face-to-face debate.
Thank you so much for calling me up here, Madam Speaker. So I want to talk about 3 things in extension, and this is going to be kind of a strange speech because I think the benefits we get on our side of the house are very difficult to weigh against the harms they have on their side of the house. I'll explain how I'm going to weigh them when I get there, but just keep in mind that I will actually talk about all the pragmatics we get out of first prop at some point and explain why we do outweigh them. Before I do that, I want to make it very clear why this would be such a good thing on a more philosophical level. So I want to talk about how this radically changes the nature of human life. Because I think one of the biggest problems that we face as human beings, and I think Buzz actually does a pretty good job explaining like why this is the case, is that there's a very great risk that we get it wrong, that we devote our lives to projects that are not satisfying to us, that do not endow our lives with meaning, and then we die, and that's it. Our life has just turned out to be meaningless. And I think this does actually happen to a lot of people. A lot of people waste their youth because they're concerned about materialistic considerations. A lot of people marry the wrong person, raise a family they're unhappy with that eventually falls apart, and then end up depressed, and then end up dead, or just choose the wrong career. So I think that it's important to keep this consideration in mind because I think it's actually a huge consideration, right? If we can eliminate the vast majority of that uncertainty and give people time to try again if they screw up the first time, I think we've radically changed the nature of human life in a way that's honestly pretty difficult to fathom, but extremely important. And I think that this does have a lot of moral weight, right? Because all the pragmatic considerations they're concerned about, all the things they've talked about, straight down government bench, have to do with like these situations in which people are living. But unless people can actually manage to endow their lives with meaning, I think all the material considerations they're concerned with are pretty much irrelevant. No thank you. But the second thing I want to talk about is the teleology of the species. I've never taken a point that way, but I really like it. So we get some weird arguments about technology and philosophy, in particular out of first proposition. So what they tell us is that the old ideas win and funerals are the only way science moves forward. So what we would tell you is that, in fact, genius is what moves science forward. And we don't think science works the way that they tell you. So, for example, Einstein had some ideas that were heterodox on quantum entanglement and continued to advance them even as theoretical evidence mounted up against him. The rest of the scientific community moved on because there was experimental evidence that showed that he was wrong, that fit better within the theory that Einstein had himself developed. But this didn't mean that Einstein was irrelevant, right? He went on to make lots and lots of contributions to science that allowed us to do things like split the atom, even after this happened. But here's the other thing that I think they don't understand about science. So these sorts of geniuses that we're talking about really do come along once every couple hundred years. So in 1905, Einstein wrote 3 papers, all of which would have independently won a Nobel Prize, and all of which radically changed the nature of physics in a period of 6 months. Nobody else, with the possible exception of Newton, has ever made that much contribution to human science. So what Andrew and I would tell you is that we would really, really like it if we had Einstein around to look at the theoretical data from, say, the Large Hadron Collider, because I just don't think we have theoretical geniuses of that level who are around right now. And even if we do, it would probably be a good thing to have more. Why is that the case? Why does this outweigh anything they can possibly give you? Well, I think humans are kind of in a weird situation, right? Like, we are born, we have this universe, we don't really know why it's here, we don't really know why we're here, it's very difficult to make sense of. But we have at least managed to make progress in figuring out how it works, which is a necessary precondition to establishing if there is any sort of underlying meaning, or if we just have to kind of make it up as we go along. Now, if we can actually have all the geniuses who have ever lived continuing to work on these scientific problems, it seems very likely that we'll reach that point far sooner, and that humans will have far better data for then making decisions about how they want to live their lives. I'll take front half.
The Einstein story is pretty, but the reason why people objected to Einstein's theories initially is because there were older people who had previous versions of science. Why is it that the inclusion of people who also think that the world is flat is in any way going to help out that advancement of science when you have a massive group of people who are in power, who are able to control the mode of thought, even if you have a genius quietly
here's the thing. Unlike your field, economics, in science you actually conduct experiments that test the theory, and then it turns out that you're right or you're wrong. So for example, one of Einstein's papers was on Brownian motion, right? He came up with a new theory to explain Brownian motion based off like the way that atomic shells are structured. It then turned out that when we applied the mathematical formula he had given, we had a perfect mathematical explanation of what we observed happening with Brownian motion. So even though people rejected his theory initially, when he advanced it in a paper, once we tested it, we found out that he was right. Like, I just don't think this is the problem. So insofar as we allow people to actually live lives that are far more meaningful when they mess up, insofar as we give them the information about the universe that allows them to make informed choices about what actually is important, insofar as we actually move the human species forward in a much, much more rapid fashion, I think we get a lot of benefits. And I just want to deal with Buzz's sort of weird existential argument here too. So what he tells you is that, like, you won't need people. So So what we would tell you is that maybe some people don't need people. Maybe that's what will make them happy. Maybe they'll be happy if they live in the woods and, I don't know, build furniture. But for these people, these people will now have the opportunity to find that out. And if it turns out that this isn't what makes them happy, then they will have other sorts of lifetimes, I guess you could call it, in which they can do the things that will make them happy. No, thank you. And now I want to talk about all the pragmatics that we get, because I think that this is kind of a weird offensive point, but I also don't think they have any offense on their side of the house at all. So it should be enough to win us around. So first, overpopulation. We'll run out of resources. So Ben gives us a response to this. What he tells us is that only the wealthy will have access to this. So what that means is that, like, as human societies evolve to the point where they're wealthy enough to access the things that allow you to be immortal functionally, they will also evolve to the point where people are having far fewer children. We don't have as big a problem with overpopulation. Now, he says something else, which is just like, people will be more fertile because they'll be fertile for a longer period. But recognize that even fertile people in Western countries still only generally only have 1 or 2 children. But let's take them at their long-run best case. Let's say that it is actually the case that having this sort of technology will cause us to eventually possibly run out of resources, leading to great moral catastrophe of some sort. So here's what I would tell you. I think there are population control measures that we could put into place, right? I think it is the case that some people will get bored and commit suicide. Now what we could do is just have some sort of system where you're only allowed to have a child insofar as that child will just make the replacement rate of the human species 1, and we can preserve whatever the status quo is. Recognize I don't think this will be a problem because we'll be moving forward technologically. But here's the thing. I think they've screwed up the moral analysis in this round. So I think it is even okay to force someone to have an abortion if necessary to enforce this policy. And here's why. Because on their side of the house, what they're saying is that someone should just die, right? That every possible benefit they could receive from life is outweighed by the fact that you might have to do something that makes one person kind of unhappy. So I just don't buy that moral analysis. I think you can make people wait to have the benefit of having children if it allows you to get all of the possible benefits that you can get from having an entire human life. And insofar as there is some replacement, they do eventually get that benefit. Extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and look to the final speaker from the government bench to conclude the case for his side.
Thank you, Mrs. Speaker. So, I don't know what an experiment is, because I'm a sociologist, but what I do know is that what really matters in society is not just who you are and how you live your life, and if you're good at, like, building furniture in the woods. What makes human life meaningful is the interactions that you have with others and the collective meanings that you construct by virtue of your interactions with them. This is why Buzz's point about the collapse of the community is extremely significant in this round. Because when that community goes away, when you continue to become more and more atomized and focused on your own comfort and subsistence, then we think people are just existentially and pragmatically worse off. And I'll develop these points further. We think it's a question of why does death need to exist? That is what our side of the house is about. We're going to answer that in 2 ways. I'm going to talk about, like, obviously, right, there's only one way to organize this round. I'm going to talk about pragmatic and then the existential points. But before that, I want to deal with the extension that we just heard. Okay, so first of all, their answer to the philosophy question was, well, we'll just give you lots of chances to get it right. No thanks, guys. So I've got 2 things on this. So first of all, this doesn't solve for the problem of suicide, right? Imagine that I do something for 40 years and then I fail massively. Guess what? I'll probably still kill myself. I'm not sure that I buy their analysis that just because you have another chance to press on, that you do so. People often have a chance to press on in the status quo, and yet they choose not to. So they're not solving that problem. Existential angst isn't going away just because there's more time. That's not where the angst comes from. But second of all, just speaking again to the point of meaning. So how you construct meanings with others is by virtue of, like, becoming socialized and learning what values to hold, how you interact with people, and just, like, on a more basic level, like, your interactions are so enmeshed that even the meaning of words is something that is socially constructed, right? So you need other people for those things to exist. At the point where you stop buying into the community, we think that that meaning breaks down, that you enter into a state of what you might call anomie, or meaninglessness, and that you fall out of the system, which endangers you, as far as suicide, as far as just being unhappy.
Point of information.
So their second big thing was about scientific progress and geniuses. So a couple things, like, So just as sort of a flippant thing, if the frequency of geniuses is every 100 years or so, it's going to be every 1,000 years now, right? Because no one's getting born. So just the likelihood of geniuses coming about diminishes. But more importantly, like, we think that the important thing that these geniuses have, their contributions, often comes about much later down the road when you've got a new perspective coming back to their work. So once you are able to escape the biases and the ideologies that they necessarily have by virtue of the time they lived in, and you can come back from a new perspective, that's when you can get some of the most mileage out of these theories. And you could point to any number of them that were not effective in their time. And this brings me to another point. All the old guys are still around, right? None of them died, though they're not old anymore. But all of the people who had entrenched biases by virtue of when they grew up, they're all still there. So it's going to be very hard for Einstein or like the round world guy to break in because all the flat earth people are still there going like, you're stupid. So we think that that's a problem. We think that scientific advancement is clearly going to slow down on our side of the house if you want to weigh this according to that pragmatic harm. Yeah, actually, sure, yeah.
In status quo, the budget involves massive wealth transfers from the young to the old to things like Social Security and Medicare. Under our system, the government has more money to spend on things like education, helping the poor. It's under our model more just and equal than your world.
So I'm not sure like where the government just got all this more money to do things. It might be something that I missed. But like, Buzz talked about this, and I'm going to talk about it some more. The reason why those institutions exist is because we can convince people on a plausible level that if they pay in now, they will reap benefits later. This is what our institutions are founded on, the life course, right? You buy in now, and then it comes back to you. We don't think people are going to want to buy in anymore because that benefit never returns to them. So I'll just go to that point now. I'll do this existential point now. So what we heard from First Government, what we heard from First Government is that just the fact of death looming at the end of your life, that the clock is always ticking, is a strong reason to just do it now, right? YOLO is the expression, right? So it drives you forward because you do only live once. You should try as much as you can, and you should try to like experiment and get out of your box. Okay, that's good. It leads to a satisfying life, we think. We think that sort of exposure is great. But you lose that on their side of the house because you have an infinitude of time. Now, we don't think this means that people are going to be like, oh, I've got all this time to try these new things. It'll be like, oh, I'll try that new thing tomorrow. I'm pretty good now. And that people will just push it back because why would they? We think comfort comes to take over the priority as opposed to doing something productive, as opposed to having some sort of drive to move forward. Okay. Now, what opposition said on the first op was that self-interest would actually diminish because, no thinking, because for some reason or another they said that the self-interest would diminish and that people would become more communal. I guess because you're like stuck in the same boat or something like that. All right. So the problem with this, as First Government rightly pointed out, is that people are already poor long-term decision makers, and we're not sure how that's going to change. We think they're going to be biased towards a current situation, which will be one of just trying to subsist. So we don't really buy their analysis. And second, I would just point you to Buzz's extension about communal life, which is what I'll talk about now. Okay, so as far as community investment, and I've already talked about this a lot in various points of this speech, we think that people often, they perceive that they have an infinitude of time to take care of the things that they want to take care of. Now, what they're bringing you is that, well, that means that people are going to like try lots of things that will make us very happy. And what we're trying to say is this actually makes it more likely that they will focus on their own desires, that they will come closed into questions of comfort and more immediate concerns, as opposed to really trying to engage and use their time widely. So what this is important is because all of our social institutions, all of them, education, marriage, healthcare, all of it is structured around the life course, right? All of that falls away. So why would you ever get married to someone, just for instance, if you know that you're going to be 35 forever and you can continue to meet people? Why would you bother having children if you yourself are going to continue to persist? Why would you do any of these things when you can just continue to live and reap your own immediate benefits? People obviously have a bias to themselves and to the present. So we think this is a huge problem just because those perceived benefits aren't always what is actually good for you in terms of meaning, in terms of community. And finally, just speaking to these pragmatic questions, which weren't that interesting anyway, so I'm not that worried about not getting them. First of all, we think population, obviously you're going to hit that limit eventually. We're seeing this in China. Rights violations accrue. Like, that's just going to happen. Eventually, you run out of space. All right, the second thing was power reification, a great point from First Government. If you can hold power indefinitely, it increases ideological stagnation. I touched on this in academia. It increases the need for the only way to get power is to take it even more so revolution becomes more likely. And finally, Buzz's great point about the differential impact this has in terms of skills, in terms of who actually is still dying, who gets acute diseases in the developing world. We think those inequalities are much more magnified. We think the world will be much worse off. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and now it's the final speaker from closing opposition to close the opposition mention and whole debate.
At the end of the day, the option for immortality solves many of the fundamental crises of the human condition and of human existence. I think we hear a lot of we get a lot of arm waving about potential catastrophes of human population, harms that are ultimately overblown. What we've showed you is why we fundamentally make it more meaningful to exist as a human, and why questions like these outweigh the chance of practical harms. I'm going to deal with exactly that question through 3 different points of analysis. First of all, what's the nature of human existence, and why does fulfilling that better? Why is that more important than the practical things we hear about? Second of all, what's best for innovation, scientific advancements, and why do these things solve for and outweigh the practical problems we hear? And then finally, will these practical problems actually even be problems? I don't think they really will. So, first of all, what is actually the nature of human existence? Why does it matter that we exist? So we tell you that life is more than just humans running around Earth, consuming resources and reproducing endlessly. We think that people have to search for some kind of meaning in life, and people need to be able to get the chances to find what that meaning is. However, we tell you there are many people who simply make poor decisions early or don't have the resources to make decisions and find that meaning. We think when more people have the option for immortality, there will be a much greater ability to find that meaning and make life more meaningful. So even if you believe that there were some harms from things like overpopulation or some resource constraints and governments had to impose some types of limitations on the liberty of people, we think that on balance, far more people would be much more fulfilled with life and make life a much more meaningful experience. And that's what we ought to care about as humans. Recognize, I think that's what this motion is really getting about. We tell you that life is much less meaningful when you actually can't engage or think about these types of concrete harms. We hear one possible objection to this from closing gov. They're well, if you just pursue something for 40 years, you'll just commit suicide. But that's the beauty of this, that you know you have another chance, so you don't have to commit suicide. And even if you did commit suicide, that decision is much more meaningful because you're able to think about what it actually means to kill oneself when you have the chance to live forever, when you have the chance to improve your life in some really meaningful way. That, I think, is another important aspect of the nature of human existence. That psychologically, people will be far more likely to consider what it actually means and come to terms with the idea of existing forever or existing as a human. We think that it makes the place of individuals in different societies much better. And recognize, I think that as societies develop and we get more and more technological advancement, and as these types of things spread to different parts of the world, more and more people are able to do these types of things. So any consequent problems of overpopulation are ultimately checked by more people being able to fulfill themselves better and actually live a meaningful existence. Finally, one point under the purpose of people in communities, we tell you that people form communities because they are much happier when they're able to do so, right? They generally like interacting with other humans. Worst case, if they don't like this, they realize that and they choose to do something else. We still think we generally have society for things like roads and bridges. That's still going to happen on our side of the house. But opening.
Why do you get to have a mulligan in life where you get to do things over and over and over again, and according to Sam's magical regulate the population means that other people who aren't born are allowed to have their chance at life? Your solution is just oh, I'll keep trying, if I screw up, that's fine, and then I'll try again, because I can keep going, as opposed to having anyone who's born get
Look, I don't, first of all, I don't think there's just a necessary good to just having a bunch of people live short, shitty existences over and over and over. That having maybe fewer people live longer times that are more meaningful is actually better for the human race. That there's no inherent preference between one person who hasn't been born yet versus someone who exists now. It's better to have a really meaningful life for someone who exists now, or the person who will be born 200 years from now to have a really meaningful life. And I'll deal more with that in a bit too. But second of all, we ask, well, what's actually best for innovation and scientific example? So recognize, we tell you, and it's not really contested, that we tell you that oftentimes scientific progress is made because of a few particular individuals. And these individuals contribute a great deal for their lives and then die and can't do that. So people like Norman Borlaug, for instance, resolves some of the greatest crises of overpopulation and resource constraints because of his genius in understanding the biology of wheat. When you have someone like that who can live much, much longer, you just get general innovations in society. And recognize, we think that because people will probably be cognizant of the potential problems of overpopulation, that you're likely to have a disproportionate amount of research focused on solving exactly those problems. But we tell you, we may not know exactly when these innovations or radical advancements will be. Like, we don't know exactly at what point in time. But we know on balance that they will happen. That is empirically true in what has happened. But you're far more likely to have them happen when people can live for much longer periods of time and develop these ideas that are targeted at their problems. We tell you, this system is simply much more likely to be effective. Insofar as any harm arises from overpopulation or things like that, we tell you there's going to be a consequent rise in the desire to fix that type of thing. So we think that's particularly important. But we also just tell you that oftentimes it's the case that geniuses and people who radically change the nature of human science are born from regular parents. So if you really are concerned about more people being existing because of things like overpopulation, we think you're just more likely to get a much greater diversity of ideas and consequently have solved things like resource constraints because you're just much able to, it's much easier to do things like feed people. But secondly, we tell you, we don't think you're particularly likely to run into problems of institutional ossification. Why? Because things like universities and governments have incentives to introduce themselves to new ideas. You see this empirically because different universities want to do things like be on the cutting edge of research and compete for the best scholars or the best ideas. We think these types of decisions are more likely to govern people. I mean, that you ultimately do get the introduction of new and better ideas. We tell you that even if some people are bad at making long-run decisions, that when they live forever, they're more likely to take into consideration future concerns because they know they'll be alive then. We think that actually makes better long-run decisions. But finally, we tell you, even if you weren't convinced that the better aspects of innovation, just saving more people, making life better, outweighed overpopulation, why are they not as concerning as we hear from them? So first of all, there are technological checks, and there's going to be a relatively low rate of population growth. We think that the countries where this is likely to be most available typically have low rates of population growth. But worst case, we tell you, you impose something like one-child policies or birth controls on the people who choose immortality. And these people are actually able to make a decision about when or if they want to, whether they would live forever or simply have children. We think that's a calculus they should be able to make. And moreover, we tell you they would generally still be able to have children. It would just have to be when some immortal person dies or something like that. We think that it's simply the case that the consequent rights violation that might come from a one-child policy, worst case, is outweighed by someone being able to live. That dying is a much greater rights violation than something like not being able to have a child, especially when you opt into something like that in the worst case. Ultimately, we're very proud to oppose.